Can I begin by thanking my colleague Willie Penrose, Deputy TD, for bringing this very important motion before the House on behalf of the Labour Party. Last Ciaran, the decision by Fianna Fáil and the Green Party to reduce the pay packets of minimum wage workers in this country by 12% is ill-conceived, it's badly thought out, and it is detrimental to the future, not just of minimum wage workers, but of all workers in the country. And to say that it's one of the stingiest decisions ever made in this House, considering the decisions that this government has made in recent times, is saying something. What I would like to do this evening is, lots of members have referred to the direct impact that it will have upon people who are currently earning minimum wage. A lot of speakers have actually referred to that. What I would like to do is actually look at this from an entirely different issue, or from a different angle. And that the measure in itself cannot be looked at in isolation when we look at some of the finer details that are included in the EU IMF documentation. And suddenly, when you start looking at that document, what's happening here through the minimum wage and its reduction, the greater strategy starts falling into place. Among the structural reforms that the IMF has signed us up to is moving towards the elimination of a cap on the size of retail premises, and as the plan puts it, with a view to enhancing competition and lowering prices for consumers. Now, if we take these two measures together, the reduction in the minimum wage and the changing to the existing retail planning guidelines, you cannot avoid the conclusion that the government is preparing the ground for international multiple chains like Walmart to come into Ireland, and doing so by softening the ground, by slashing the prospective wage bills of these companies and easing the regulatory framework in which these companies will actually be coming into Ireland with. Of course, that's not to ignore the fact as well that a lot of these companies will be acquiring lands that are probably on their way into NAMA, or are probably into NAMA already, and will end up being a bailout to the type of friends the Fianna Fáil have acquired over the last decade. So, not only is the step in the reduction in the minimum wage a step too far, it is also a step in the wrong direction, and one that will have serious negative ramifications for the existing retail sector, workers that are actually in the retail sector, and the broader community. A good body study that was published in recent times shows that the economies of scale in food retailing are exhausted after 2,000 square feet. And the research also shows that moving towards hypermarket formats inevitably lead to job losses. So it's very curious to see that the minimum wage provision included in the IMF deal was actually in there at all. And it's unclear as to whose behest it was actually included. Minister Gormley says that Ollie Rehn insisted upon it. The Taoiseach says it was a government decision. But the fact of the matter is that it's in there. And it's interesting to note, in the government's rejection of the Labour Party proposal this evening, and in its own amendment to it, it talks about the minimum wage being good for the retail industry. However, workers didn't want to see a reduction in the minimum wage. Employers did not want to see a reduction in the minimum wage. In fact, the retail industry, in its own submissions to government, said they didn't want to see any change in the minimum wage. Where they wanted to see was reform in the area of the GLCs, and that the minimum wage was not an issue to come onto the table. However, it has been brought on by the present government. So what we're dealing with, and if he actually listens to sectoral interest, and it has been debated in this House before, the biggest issue facing the retail industry is the tyranny of upward-only rent reviews. That is what's actually causing jobs, and causing jobs to be lost in this country. 30,000 jobs have been lost in the retail sector in the last 2 years because of this government's inability, or its choice not to actually deal with upward-only rent reviews and the tyranny of them. So, what we're at the moment is that, no doubt, we will hear, and we've heard in this House this evening, that the slashing of the minimum wage will create more jobs, it will create more competition, and it will lead to cheaper products. But at what price, Last Ciaran? Any proposed move to cheap labour out-of-town retail hypermarkets will sound a death knell for small and medium-sized shops at local level in towns, villages and high streets across the country. How on earth will local companies be able to compete with this cheap employment, cheap rents and unregulated planning guidelines that allow products like Walmart, that we know actually inevitably create a devouring mechanism within the retail sectors and drive sustainable, good employers actually out of the industry, creating further employment and greater employment levels? Let's conclude. In essence, what we're witnessing here this evening by the Fianna Fáil and the Green Party's decision to reduce the minimum wage, it's not just an attack upon existing jobs and working conditions in those jobs, it's also an attack upon existing businesses who are struggling against the tide to stay afloat in these tough economic times. And what we're actually seeing here is a softening up of the existing workforce, not just those in minimum wage, for lower wages in the future by a relaxation or a deregulation, the type of deregulation that has got this country into the mess it's presently in. Thank you.